The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her loose-fitting fatigues and pulled her cap low over her eyes. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another nervous recruit reporting for her first day at the remote military facility in Nevada. Her slight frame and deliberately clumsy movements, as she stumbled with her duffel bag, only reinforced the impression of an inexperienced young woman who had somehow found herself in over her head. What the soldiers at Fort Blackwater didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 8 years as one of the CIA's most elite operatives, specializing in deep cover infiltration and counterintelligence. Her mission here wasn't to learn how to be a soldier. It was to uncover a dangerous conspiracy that threatened national security from within the very heart of the military establishment. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had been sitting in a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia, when her handler, Director Patricia Hawthorne, had slid a classified folder across the polished conference table. The contents were disturbing. Intelligence suggested that someone within the Special Forces training program was selling classified information to foreign operatives. Worse yet, there were indications that this person had been recruiting other soldiers to join what appeared to be a sophisticated spy network. The investigation had reached a dead end through conventional channels. Phone taps, email monitoring, and financial records had yielded nothing concrete. The suspected traitor was too careful, too well-trained in counter-surveillance techniques. The only way to get close enough to gather evidence was from the inside, and that required someone who could blend in seamlessly with a new group of recruits while possessing the skills necessary to conduct covert surveillance. Sarah had volunteered immediately. At 28, she was young enough to pass as a new recruit, and her petite build and unassuming appearance made her the perfect candidate for undercover work. She had spent years perfecting the art of making herself invisible, of becoming exactly what people expected to see rather than who she really was. The cover story was simple but effective. Sarah Mitchell was a college dropout from Ohio who had enlisted after a series of dead-end jobs and personal setbacks. She had no military experience, no special skills, and no connections that might raise suspicions. On paper, she was exactly the kind of person the military often attracted, someone looking for structure, purpose, and a fresh start. As she walked across the compound that first morning, Sarah took careful note of everything around her. The layout of the buildings, the positions of security cameras, the daily routines of the personnel she observed. Years of training had taught her to absorb information constantly while appearing completely oblivious to anything beyond her immediate concerns. The other recruits in her unit seemed like a typical mix of young men and women from various backgrounds. There was Marcus Thompson, a former college football player from Texas who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the strongest person in any room. Jenny Walsh came from a military family and spoke with the sharp precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. David Park was quiet and intense, a computer programmer who had enlisted after losing his job in a corporate downsizing. What struck Sarah immediately was how seriously the training staff took their jobs. The drill sergeants were demanding but fair, pushing the recruits to their physical and mental limits while maintaining an atmosphere of mutual respect. It didn't fit with what she had expected to find in a facility harboring a security breach. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything, was in charge of their unit. During their first meeting, he had looked each recruit up and down with the calculating gaze of someone assessing both strengths and weaknesses. When his eyes settled on Sarah, she had forced herself to fidget nervously and avoid direct eye contact, playing her role perfectly. The physical training was genuinely challenging, even for someone with Sarah's conditioning. She had to be careful to perform at a level consistent with her cover identity, good enough to avoid being kicked out of the program, but not so good as to raise questions about her background. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention to detail. During weapons training, she deliberately struggled with basic marksmanship while secretly knotting the security protocols around the armory. When they practiced hand-to-hand combat, she allowed herself to be easily overpowered by her sparring partners while memorizing their techniques and identifying their weaknesses. Every moment was an exercise in controlled deception. The real challenge came during the evening hours when the recruits were left to themselves in the barracks. This was when Sarah needed to establish relationships with her fellow soldiers while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the facility and its personnel. She had to become someone her bunkmates would trust and confide in, all while maintaining her cover as a struggling recruit. She found her opening through Jenny Walsh, whose family military background made her a natural leader among the recruits. Sarah began asking Jenny for advice about everything from proper equipment maintenance to understanding military protocol. The approach worked perfectly. Jenny seemed to enjoy playing the role of mentor, and her willingness to help the apparently struggling Sarah created opportunities for longer conversations. It was during one of these late-night talks that Sarah first heard something that made her instincts prickle with suspicion. Jenny mentioned that some of the more advanced trainees had been selected for special assignments that took them off the base for days at a time. When Sarah asked innocent questions about these assignments, Jenny's answers were vague and evasive. Marcus Thompson provided another piece of the puzzle when he complained about the unfairness of the selection process for these special assignments. According to him, the soldiers chosen weren't necessarily the best performers in training. Some of them were actually among the weaker recruits, which didn't make sense if they were being selected for advanced training programs. Sarah filed this information away while continuing to build her relationships with the other recruits. She volunteered for extra kitchen duty, which gave her access to different parts of the facility and opportunities to observe the daily routines of the permanent staff. She offered to help her bunkmates with their studies, creating opportunities for late-night conversations that might reveal useful information. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice patterns that didn't appear in any of the official briefing materials she had studied before arriving. Certain staff members seemed to pay unusual attention to specific recruits, and these weren't necessarily the ones who were excelling in training. There were hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when other people approached. Most telling of all, there were personnel on the base who didn't appear on any of the organizational charts her CIA contacts had provided. The breakthrough came during her second week when Sarah was assigned to clean the administrative offices after hours. While dusting the desk of Captain Morrison, one of the senior training officers, she discovered a partially hidden folder containing what appeared to be psychological evaluation reports on various recruits. The evaluations weren't focused on military aptitude or leadership potential. They were assessments of each recruit's susceptibility to recruitment for activities that the reports never specifically identified. Sarah memorized as much of the information as possible before carefully replacing the folder exactly as she had found it. The reports painted a clear picture. Someone was systematically identifying recruits who might be willing to engage in questionable activities, possibly including the sale of classified information. The selection criteria included factors like financial stress, family problems, and general dissatisfaction with military life. What made the discovery even more significant was the realization that several of the recruits in her own unit matched the profiles described in the reports. David Park, the former programmer, was dealing with significant debt from his previous job loss. Marcus Thompson had mentioned family medical bills that were straining his finances. Even Jenny Walsh, despite her military background, had expressed frustration with what she saw as the slow pace of her career advancement. Sarah realized she was witnessing the early stages of a recruitment operation designed to identify and cultivate potential assets within the military. The Foreign Intelligence Service behind this operation had developed a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit the vulnerabilities of American service members, and they were operating with a level of access that suggested high-level infiltration of the military command structure. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced that several recruits, including Sarah herself, had been selected for a special training exercise that would take place over the weekend at a location off the main base. The exercise was described as an opportunity to apply their training in a more realistic environment, but Sarah's instincts told her this was something far more significant. As she packed her gear for the weekend exercise, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that preceded dangerous missions. She was about to move from passive observation to active engagement with whatever conspiracy she had discovered. The soldiers around her had no idea that the woman they saw as a struggling recruit was actually a highly trained operative who was closing in on their secret operation. The transport vehicles arrived just after sunrise, and Sarah climbed aboard with her fellow recruits, knowing that the next phase of her mission was about to begin. Whatever was waiting for them at the off-site location, She was ready to face it while maintaining her cover as just another inexperienced soldier trying to find her place in the military hierarchy. The convoy of military vehicles wound through the desert landscape for over an hour before reaching their destination. Sarah kept her face pressed to the window, maintaining her cover as an excited recruit while mentally mapping their route and noting potential escape paths. The facility they eventually reached looked nothing like the official training grounds they had left behind. Hidden in a valley between two ridges, the compound consisted of several unmarked buildings surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. There were no identifying signs or flags, and the guards at the entrance wore standard military fatigues with no unit insignia. Sarah's trained eye immediately recognized this as a black site, a location designed to exist off the official records. Captain Morrison, who had accompanied them on the journey, gathered the selected recruits in a briefing room that looked more like a corporate conference facility than a military installation. The walls were lined with sophisticated communication equipment, and Sarah noticed several faces she didn't recognize among the personnel present. These weren't the training staff from Fort Blackwater. Morrison's briefing was deliberately vague, describing the weekend exercise as an opportunity to participate in advanced psychological operations training. The recruits would be working with experienced operatives to learn techniques for gathering intelligence and conducting surveillance in civilian environments. It sounded legitimate enough, but Sarah's instincts were screaming warnings. The first red flag came when they were asked to surrender their personal communication devices for the duration of the exercise. This was explained as a necessary security measure to maintain operational security, but Sarah recognized it as a technique for isolating potential recruits from outside contact. She handed over her phone along with the others, knowing that her CIA contacts would be expecting a scheduled check-in that she would now be unable to make. The second warning sign was the introduction of their weekend instructor, a man who introduced himself only as Colonel Adams. Sarah had memorized the personnel files of every legitimate military officer who might be involved in this type of training, and Adams wasn't among them. His bearing and speech patterns suggested military background, but something about him felt wrong. He was too smooth, too polished, and his eyes held the calculating coldness she had learned to associate with foreign intelligence operatives. The training began innocuously enough. Adams led them through exercises in observation and memory techniques, teaching them how to gather information about individuals and locations without being detected. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of pretending to learn skills she had mastered years ago while trying to determine the true purpose of the instruction. The breakthrough came during a lunch break when Sarah managed to slip away from the group unnoticed. Her years of experience in covert operations had taught her how to move through secured facilities without triggering alarms or attracting attention. She made her way toward the administrative area of the compound, looking for evidence that would confirm her suspicions about the true nature of this operation. What she found exceeded her worst fears. In a locked office that she accessed using techniques learned during her CIA training, Sarah discovered communications equipment that was clearly not standard military issue. The computer terminals displayed interface screens in what appeared to be Russian Cyrillic characters, and the documentation scattered across the desk contained references to American military personnel by code names rather than their actual identities. Among the papers was a detailed psychological profile of David Park, the computer programmer from her unit. The file contained information that went far beyond what would normally be available through military records, details about his family, his financial situation, his personal relationships, and his psychological vulnerabilities. At the bottom of the file was a recruitment timeline with specific milestones for gradually drawing him into compromising activities. Sarah photographed as much of the material as possible using a miniature camera concealed in her uniform, a piece of equipment she had managed to smuggle past the security screening. The evidence was damning. This wasn't a legitimate military training facility, but rather a front for a foreign intelligence operation designed to recruit and turn American military personnel. The most chilling discovery was a master list containing the names of over 40 current and former military personnel who had apparently been successfully recruited over the past 2 years. The list included their current assignments, their access levels to classified information, and the specific types of intelligence they had been tasked with collecting. Sarah realized she had stumbled onto one of the most sophisticated spy rings ever discovered operating within the American military. She was about to leave the office when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Moving quickly but quietly, Sarah repositioned herself behind the door just as someone entered the room. Through the gap between the door and frame, she could see Colonel Adams talking on a secure phone in what was clearly Russian. Her language training allowed her to understand enough of the conversation to confirm her worst suspicions. Adams was reporting to his handlers about the progress of the current recruitment operation. Sarah remained hidden until Adams left the room, then waited several additional minutes before making her way back toward the training area. She had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation. But now, she faced the challenge of getting that information back to her CIA contacts while maintaining her cover and ensuring the safety of the genuinely innocent recruits who had been brought here. The afternoon training session took on a more sinister tone once Sarah understood what was really happening. Adams began introducing scenarios that involved accessing classified information and conducting surveillance on fellow military personnel. The exercises were presented as hypothetical training situations, but Sarah recognized them as carefully designed tests to identify recruits who might be willing to cross ethical lines. David Park seemed particularly responsive to these scenarios, asking detailed questions about techniques for accessing computer systems without authorization. Jenny Walsh appeared uncomfortable with some of the exercises, but was clearly trying to maintain her image as a dedicated soldier. Marcus Thompson seemed mostly confused by the psychological aspects of the training, but was going along with the program. As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice that the recruits were being subtly separated into different groups. Those who showed enthusiasm for the more questionable aspects of the training were receiving additional attention from Adams and his staff. Others, including herself, were being relegated to more basic exercises under the supervision of junior instructors. The evening brought another crucial development when Adams announced that some of the recruits would be participating in an advanced exercise that involved spending the night at an off-site location. David Park and 2 other recruits were selected for this special training, while the rest would remain at the compound. Sarah realized this was likely the point where actual recruitment would take place. The selected recruits would be isolated from their peers and subjected to intensive psychological manipulation designed to compromise their loyalty to the United States. Once they crossed that line, they would be trapped in a web of blackmail and coercion that would make it nearly impossible for them to escape. She had to act quickly to prevent David and the others from disappearing into the recruitment pipeline, but any overt action would blow her cover and likely result in the entire operation being shut down and moved elsewhere. She needed to find a way to sabotage the recruitment effort while gathering enough additional evidence to ensure that the entire spy ring could be dismantled. The solution came to her during the evening meal when she overheard one of the guards discussing the security protocols for the overnight exercise. The selected recruits would be transported to a remote cabin in the mountains where they would undergo what was described as intensive psychological evaluation. The location was isolated enough that any compromising activities could take place without risk of outside observation. Sarah realized she had an opportunity to turn the situation to her advantage. If she could find a way to accompany the transport or follow it to the mountain location, she might be able to gather evidence of the actual recruitment process while simultaneously protecting the innocent recruits from being fully compromised. The challenge was finding a way to insert herself into the operation without raising suspicions. Her cover as a struggling recruit actually worked in her favor. Adams and his team had clearly written her off as unsuitable for recruitment, which meant they weren't paying close attention to her movements. As the selected recruits prepared for departure, Sarah began implementing a plan that would require all of her training and experience to execute successfully. She had identified the weakness in the security protocols that would allow her to follow the transport, and she had devised a way to communicate her location to her CIA contacts despite the communication blackout. The evening departure took place under cover of darkness, with David Park and the 2 other selected recruits climbing into an unmarked van accompanied by Adams and 2 other operatives. Sarah watched from her barracks window as the vehicle disappeared into the desert night, knowing that she had perhaps hours to prevent 3 young Americans from being turned into traitors. What Adams and his team didn't know was that they had spent the entire weekend unknowingly training one of the CIA's most skilled operatives. Sarah had been studying their methods, memorizing their procedures, and preparing for the moment when she would drop her cover and move from passive observation to direct action. That moment was rapidly approaching. As she gathered her gear and prepared to slip away from the compound, Sarah reflected on how the next few hours would determine whether she could save the recruits while exposing a spy ring that had been operating successfully for years. The soldiers who had dismissed her as just another struggling recruit were about to discover exactly who they had been dealing with all along. Sarah waited until the compound had settled into its nighttime routine before beginning her escape. Years of training had taught her that the most dangerous part of any covert operation was the transition from passive surveillance to active engagement. Once she left the barracks, there would be no going back to her cover identity. Moving through the shadows between buildings, she avoided the patrol routes she had memorized during her time at the facility. The guards were competent but predictable, following patterns that left small windows of opportunity for someone who knew what to look for. Sarah had spent hours observing these patterns while maintaining her cover as a confused recruit. Her first objective was reaching the motor pool, where she had identified a motorcycle that would allow her to follow the van carrying David Park and the other recruits. The vehicle was an older military bike that wouldn't be immediately missed, and Sarah had the skills necessary to start it without keys, another ability that her recruit persona would never have possessed. The engine started with a low rumble that seemed impossibly loud in the desert stillness. Sarah held her breath, waiting for alarms or shouts that would indicate her escape had been detected. When nothing happened, she carefully guided the motorcycle toward the compound's perimeter, using a gap in the fence that she had discovered during her reconnaissance. Once beyond the facility, Sarah pushed the bike to its limits across the desert terrain. She had memorized the route the van had taken, and her training in tracking and pursuit allowed her to follow their path even in the darkness. The recruits and their handlers had perhaps a 30-minute head start, but Sarah was confident she could close that gap. The mountain cabin where the intensive recruitment was scheduled to take place sat in an isolated valley, accessible only by a single winding road. Sarah approached cautiously, leaving the motorcycle hidden among the rocks and proceeding on foot for the final approach. Her years of experience in hostile territory had taught her how to move silently across any type of terrain. What she found when she reached the cabin exceeded her worst expectations. Through the windows, she could see David Park and the two other recruits seated around a table, while Adams and his team subjected them to what appeared to be intensive psychological manipulation. The session had clearly been going on for hours, and Sarah could see the strain on the young soldiers' faces. The recruitment technique being employed was sophisticated and methodical. Adams was using a combination of isolation, sleep deprivation, and carefully crafted arguments to break down the recruits' resistance to compromise. He painted a picture of American military leadership as corrupt and incompetent while presenting cooperation with foreign intelligence as a form of patriotic service to a higher cause. Sarah realized she was witnessing a master manipulator at work. Adams understood exactly which psychological buttons to push, and he was systematically dismantling each recruit's moral foundations while offering them financial incentives and promises of advancement within what he claimed was an elite international organization. David Park seemed particularly susceptible to the approach. His financial difficulties and frustration with his civilian career had left him vulnerable to arguments about taking control of his own destiny. Sarah could see him beginning to waver as Adams painted a picture of wealth and purpose that would solve all of his problems. The other two recruits were showing more resistance, but even they were clearly being worn down by the relentless psychological pressure. Sarah knew that if this session continued for much longer, all three young Americans would likely cross the line from innocent soldiers into compromised assets of a foreign intelligence service. She had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation, but her immediate priority was preventing these recruits from being fully turned. Once they accepted Adams' offer and began providing classified information, their lives would be effectively over. They would become trapped in a web of blackmail and coercion that would destroy their careers, their relationships, and quite possibly their lives. Sarah began implementing a plan that would require perfect timing and execution. She had identified the security weaknesses of the cabin and the positioning of Adams' team. More importantly, she had recognized that Adams himself was the key to the entire operation. Remove him from the equation, and the carefully orchestrated recruitment session would collapse. The first phase of her plan involved creating a diversion that would draw some of Adams' team away from the main room. Sarah used her knowledge of the facility's power systems to cause a partial blackout that would trigger security protocols while giving her the cover she needed to approach the building. As expected, two of Adams' operatives left the cabin to investigate the power failure. This reduced the odds Sarah would face when she made her move, but it also meant she had a limited window before they returned. Everything would depend on her ability to neutralize the remaining opposition and extract the recruits before the full security team could respond. Sarah's entry into the cabin was swift and decisive. Years of training in close quarters combat allowed her to disable the guard posted at the door before he could raise an alarm. Moving through the building with the confidence of someone who had memorized every detail of its layout, she positioned herself outside the main room where the recruitment session was taking place. Adams was in the middle of making his final pitch to David Park when Sarah burst through the door. The transformation from struggling recruit to elite operative was instantaneous and shocking. The woman who had stumbled through basic training exercises moved with deadly precision, disarming Adams' remaining bodyguard before anyone in the room could fully process what was happening. The reaction from the recruits was exactly what Sarah had anticipated. David Park and his companions stared in complete bewilderment at the woman they had known as Sarah Mitchell, unable to reconcile her previous behavior with the supremely confident operative now standing before them. Adams himself seemed momentarily stunned by the revelation that his operation had been compromised from within. Sarah used their shock to her advantage, quickly identifying herself as a CIA operative and explaining the true nature of what had been happening to them. The recruits' confusion and fear were palpable as they realized how close they had come to being recruited into a spy ring that would have destroyed their lives. Adams recovered from his initial surprise and attempted to regain control of the situation through psychological manipulation. He argued that Sarah was the real traitor, working to prevent dedicated soldiers from serving their country's true interests. His training in persuasion and manipulation was evident as he tried to turn the recruits against their unexpected rescuer. For a moment, Sarah wondered if Adams might succeed in convincing the confused and exhausted young soldiers that she was the enemy. David Park looked particularly torn, his mind struggling to process the competing narratives about loyalty, patriotism, and service that had been presented to him over the past several hours. The deadlock was broken when the operatives who had been investigating the power failure returned to the cabin. Their attempt to retake control of the situation quickly escalated into a firefight that removed any doubt about which side represented the genuine threat to American security. Sarah's combat training proved decisive in the confrontation that followed. While protecting the recruits from crossfire, she systematically neutralized Adams' team with a level of skill that left no doubt about her true identity and capabilities. The woman who had pretended to struggle with basic marksmanship demonstrated why she was considered one of the CIA's most elite operatives. Adams himself proved to be a formidable opponent, revealing combat skills that confirmed Sarah's suspicions about his background in foreign intelligence services. The fight between them was brief but intense, ending only when Sarah managed to disable him without causing permanent injury. She needed Adams alive to provide information about the broader spy network he had been operating. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Sarah used the communications equipment in the cabin to contact her CIA handlers and coordinate the extraction of evidence and personnel from both the mountain location and the main compound. The recruits, still reeling from their narrow escape from recruitment into espionage, provided valuable testimony about the techniques that had been used against them. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the spy ring that Adams had been operating. The network included compromised personnel at multiple military installations across the United States, and the intelligence they had provided to foreign handlers had caused significant damage to American national security interests. David Park and the other recruits were cleared of any wrongdoing and returned to their normal training programs after extensive debriefing sessions. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also given them valuable insight into the sophisticated techniques that foreign intelligence services used to recruit American military personnel. Sarah's successful infiltration and dismantling of the spy ring earned recognition from the highest levels of both the CIA and military intelligence communities. More importantly, it had prevented 3 young Americans from being turned into traitors and had exposed a security threat that might have operated undetected for years longer. The soldiers at Fort Blackwater who had dismissed Sarah as just another struggling recruit learned valuable lessons about making assumptions based on appearances. The woman they had seen as weak and incompetent had actually been one of the most dangerous operatives in the American intelligence community, and her presence among them had been the result of careful planning rather than random chance. Adams and his surviving team members were processed through the federal justice system, though much of their trial was conducted behind closed doors due to national security considerations. The evidence Sarah had gathered during her undercover mission proved crucial in securing convictions and mapping the full extent of the foreign intelligence network that had been operating on American soil. The incident led to significant changes in security protocols at military training facilities and enhanced screening procedures for personnel involved in advanced training programs. Sarah's recommendations, based on her first-hand observation of how the recruitment operation had functioned, became part of the standard procedures for identifying and preventing similar infiltrations. For Sarah herself, the mission represented both a professional triumph and a personal reminder of the costs associated with her chosen career. The weeks she had spent living as a struggling recruit had given her insights into the lives of ordinary soldiers that she had never experienced during her years as an elite operative. The young men and women she had trained alongside represented the best of American military service, dedicated, patriotic, and willing to sacrifice for their country. The fact that foreign intelligence services were actively working to corrupt and exploit their dedication only reinforced Sarah's commitment to the often invisible war being fought to protect American interests around the world. As she returned to her normal duties within the CIA, Sarah carried with her a renewed appreciation for the importance of her work and the very real threats faced by the ordinary soldiers who form the backbone of American military strength. The mission had reminded her that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but within the institutions that defend freedom itself.